Hope everyone can hear me clearly. All right. So yeah, thanks for being here. So I want to talk a bit about the concept and ethics of laziness. And this is actually quite new for me. It's a new research topic because usually I work on completely different things like the ethics of human reproduction and genetics and so on. So since it's the beginning of my project, I don't have any sort of big ideas or, revolutionary theories yet, but hopefully, I have something interesting to say about this, some, ideas to share, and I look forward to some discussion as well, because I'm really interested in people's views actually about laziness, or their concerns about laziness, or what they think is puzzling about this concept and so on. So I'd be really, curious to hear your views actually. Anyway, what I'm gonna do, I'm mainly gonna give a bit of a general background about, how I came, or what I think, why I think more research needs to be done on the ethics of laziness. And then I'm going to give one example of how I think we should go about it. So the concept of laziness has strongly negative connotations. So we call someone who we take to be lazy a sloth, a slob, a deadbeat, a passenger, a lump, a parasite, a wastrel, a couch potato. And, this is the sort of image that comes to mind when we think about lazy people. It's not very flattering. And even though we know that we don't usually look like that or act like that, research suggests that laziness is actually one of the most commonly self-ascribed weaknesses. And this is true even for people who work very hard. So, for example, Barack Obama once said in an interview that the personality trait he despises most in himself is his laziness. And Stephen Fry actually said exactly the same thing about himself in one of his recent podcasts. But surely Barack Obama and Stephen Fry, they have achieved a lot in different ways, of course. And, part of the reason why they've achieved a lot is, through their hard work and diligence. So we wouldn't really think of them as lazy, but, they think of themselves as lazy. So we judge others for being lazy. We judge ourselves for being lazy. We're clearly bothered by laziness, by lazy people in one way or another. I'm just going to close my window because it's quite noisy. That's better. So we're clearly bothered by laziness and by lazy people in one way or another. And interestingly, and importantly, laziness is typically not only considered a personal failing, but also a moral one. It's often seen as a vice or a sin. So, for example, laziness is related to one of the deadly sins in Christian thought, the deadly sin of sloth. And because we think laziness is morally bad, we tend to think that the lazy do not even deserve our pity or help. It's up to them to fix their problem. And interestingly, negative judgments about laziness can be found across different cultures. So in all 5 major religions, for example, we can find religious texts that criticize laziness. So it's near universal, this condemnation of laziness. And I think there's reason to believe that our current use of the concept of laziness actually results in widespread and significant harm. It plausibly perpetuates what social psychologist Devin Price refers to as the laziness lie. And the laziness lie, that's the belief that our worth is dependent on our productivity, the idea that we can and should always do more and that we can't really trust our own feelings and limits. So for example, if we feel like resting, we don't really trust our feeling that, that we've reached the limit. We quickly think we're being lazy and that we should continue to do more. We don't trust our own feelings and limits. And these arguably mistaken but widespread views results, as we all know, in burnout and profound anxiety, low esteem when we can't live up to the expectations of a productive life. And they actually also impede access to appropriate help, including medical help. So, because once the laziness label is attributed, this often means the end of a search for or an offer of medical help. So I'm thinking here especially people with chronic physical or mental health conditions, people with chronic fatigue syndrome, long COVID, maybe ADHD. So they themselves or others might attribute their behavior to laziness, and that often means the end of a search for medical help. They just think, it's laziness, I have to fix that problem. That's it. Whereas actually they need other help, other kinds of help. Attributions of laziness also frequently result in discriminatory practices, which may have serious implications for access to, for example, employment or also healthcare services. So, for example, people with obesity are often swiftly labeled as lazy. And because of this label, research shows that they frequently miss out on job opportunities. So judging oneself or someone else as lazy can have very serious consequences. Unfortunately, in recent years, there has been an increasing acknowledgement of and societal pushback against the ways we think about laziness and our treatment of the allegedly lazy. So initially, most popular work on laziness addressed the question of how to overcome laziness, how to stop being lazy. But more recently, there are also books with the message either that laziness is good, with tips about how to be lazier, or that laziness does not exist. So the idea there being that when we think someone is lazy, there's usually another explanation for what we think, what we think is actually laziness. So it could be depression, anxiety, just tiredness, lack of motivation, and so on. And there is also some philosophical work, not really directly on laziness, but especially on related concepts such as idleness and slacking. But all in all, not very much has been written on this topic. People have touched upon it, but there's not that much philosophical work on it. So we have a lot of popular books and a few academic books related to laziness. And there are also, as I mentioned before, this interest from within society. There are some movements that seemingly promote laziness, although it's not clear what it's actually laziness that they promote, but it's definitely related and worth mentioning. So for example, in China, there is the Tangping group or the lying flat movement, and it's growing increasingly popular. So it encourages people to lie flat, and that actually means to sort of opt out of the struggle for workplace success and to reject the promise of consumer fulfillment. And they see lying flat as a form of silent resistance against China's hyper-competitive work environment. So, and interestingly, the Chinese government sees this movement as a threat, and it is censoring it. So, for example, they took down the blog of the so-called master of lying down, the one who sort of started this movement, Luo Huazong. And he started this blog about 5-6 years ago, a blog called Lying Flat is Justice. So they see it as a form of justice. He had done jobs that required very hard work, 12-hour shifts in factories. And at some point it was just too much. He quit. And then he just took on the occasional job just to earn enough to get by. And even when he works, he really does the minimum that is required. So, for example, he now and then just plays a corpse in Chinese movies, so very low key, even when he's actually working. And he just lives with his family now and spends his days reading philosophy and the news and working out. So he said it was an ideal lifestyle, allowing him to live minimally and think and express freely. And yes, there was this tweet by Wonder Hag, I do not want a career, I want to sit on the porch, and that was shared widely. It quickly received more than 400,000 likes, again suggesting many people are actually thinking of, having a different lifestyle. They no longer want to take part in this quest for careers and wealth, and they no longer want to work very hard. They just sort of want to take it very easy. Now, the important work on laziness is being done, and action, or inaction rather, is being undertaken. I think that a research gap remains. So I think that the current societal and academic debate about laziness, the important and valuable, has several shortcomings. And the first shortcoming is that it actually sends quite a confusing message, because from the current literature, it's not clear whether laziness is bad and something to overcome, or is good and something to embrace, or does not exist. I mean, there's really a lack of normative direction. And I think part of the reason is that hardly any of the existing work of laziness actually defines or describes what laziness is. So it's very much an under-theorized concept. And when you start to think about it, it's not so easy to describe what laziness exactly is. And I think that if we want to make progress in our thinking about laziness and want to reduce the harm that is caused by the way we use this concept of laziness, we should at least know what it is. And as part of my research project, I hope to be able to define or describe laziness. So I think there's definitely work to be done there. And then a second shortcoming of the current debates and the current conversations about laziness, that this existing work is largely targeted at one group, and that's sort of middle class people or a bit above that, who work very hard. So think again of Obama. So it was even a bestseller on laziness, was even on his favorite books list, and Stephen Fry, who I mentioned before. So very, well-off people who work very hard, and maybe then, they read these books and they learn how to either care less about, the fact that they're lazy, or how to overcome the laziness. But our current use of the concept of laziness, I think, is relevant and frequently harmful for a much larger group that has been mostly neglected in discussions about laziness, but who may actually benefit most from our rethinking of the concept of laziness. So I'm thinking here, for example, of people with chronic health conditions. So I think of long COVID, chronic fatigue syndrome, obesity, ADHD, and so on. So here are just two testimonies, but I found many more. A testimony by a long COVID patient who said, before I got sick with long COVID, I was healthy, I was able-bodied, 26-year-old in prime physical shape. I ran, biked, boxed, fought yoga, and lifted weights. And I shouldn't have to share these details for people to believe that my illness was real, not in my head, not within my control. But claims that long COVID patients like me are lazy or causing our own illnesses unfortunately persist. And then an ME patient, so someone with chronic fatigue syndrome, said, like, the worst thing about having this illness is people thinking you're lazy. I don't want people to think I'm not pulling in my weight or trying to cope out of things, or I cannot be bothered to do that, not putting as much effort in as them. Just things like that. I didn't want people to think less of me, especially my teachers and friends. So for people with these chronic conditions, the accusations of laziness are very harmful. And then, of course, there are other groups that may benefit from a rethinking of how we employ the concept of laziness, but who are often forgotten in debates about laziness, and that is people from certain ethnic groups or the unemployed or the people without a home. So there was this survey that it's as part of the American National Election Studies in 2012. And, they asked if Blacks would only try, they gave people statements. The red are self-described conservatives, white conservatives, and blue are self-described white liberals. And then they present them with these statements. If Blacks would only try harder, they could be just as well off as whites. And as you can see, a lot of white conservatives, more than 60% thought that statement was true. And among white liberals, also more than 25% thought that statement was true. And when they were confronted with the statement, Black people are lazy, again, a very high number believe that statement to be true. So, and the same is true of people without a home, as I mentioned before. And then, of course, that had this idea that they're lazy has enormous consequences, because people just think, well, we shouldn't give them benefits, no state benefits, because they're just lazy. They should just work a bit harder. Or if we give them benefits, they just kind of take advantage of it because they're lazy. So the typical generic advice currently found in the laziness literature, if we can call it that, to work less and relax more, or the opposite advice, to work a bit more and stop procrastinating, won't be of much help to individuals belonging to these groups that are so swiftly labeled as lazy. So I think there's an urgent need to include them in public debates and academic work on laziness, and to investigate how rethinking the concepts of laziness could actually benefit them, or at least cause less harm. And then another shortcoming of the current debate about laziness is that it's primarily recommends strategies for self-care. So the idea that the question, trying to give an answer to questions like how can individuals tackle laziness related problems to improve their own well-being and health. And though self-care is very important, I think one shortcoming with this strategy is that it largely ignores how individual actions can also affect societal changes. So just to give one simple example, so think of an email signature that indicates that one doesn't really expect a reply outside of the respondent's normal working hours. I think that's an example of an individual action, but one that is primarily aimed at achieving societal change. And it is sort of related to laziness, I think. And so I think we need to think more about that, how our individual actions can achieve change in a positive way. And I think a second shortcoming is that the current emphasis on self-care also largely ignores structural approaches to tackling problems arising from our current use of the laziness concept. So, maybe we should think more about, I don't know, I haven't put much thought in this, but like, if there's reason to do this, the introduction of awareness courses for employers and medical students about potential harmful effects of laziness stigma. Or we could think about legal changes. So, for example, in Belgium, where I'm from, there was just a new law that was introduced that gives civil servants the legal right to disconnect from work. So this means in practice that they can't be contacted outside of normal working hours. There are exceptions, of course. I mean, there could be agreements made, or if there's something super urgent, but sort of as a general rule, they can't be contacted outside normal working hours. And civil servants also shouldn't be disadvantaged by not answering the phone or picking up emails out of hours. And the goal here is to reduce stress and burnout and increase productivity. Since the goal here is to actually increase productivity, it's not clear whether this sort of law actually promotes laziness, but at least it gives people more opportunities perhaps to be lazy. It gives them more free time. And then a final shortcoming of current work or current conversations about laziness, I think, is that it actually largely ignores questions regarding our attitudes and actions towards the truly lazy, if any such person exists. So those who arguably are truly lazy may suffer from disapproval, neglect, perhaps even discrimination, and questions arise as to whether the truly lazy actually deserve to be treated so harshly. Maybe this will depend, among other things, on whether and when one's laziness is actually someone else's business. Does the laziness cause harm to the lazy person to the extent that we should intervene? Does the laziness cause harm to others? Is it something like a right to be lazy? And if so, what would such a right imply? For example, would it simply imply that we let the lazy be, or would it imply something more like a positive duty to provide welfare aid? And does what we owe to, the truly lazy depend on what sort of or what type of laziness they exhibit? So I think it's sort of interesting to think about that. Like maybe, we have good reasons to distinguish different types of laziness, like physical laziness or moral laziness. And you think that moral laziness, might be worse than physical laziness and might require a different response. And there are also questions I think we need to tackle as to whether it's actually good to have some lazy people in society, if this could increase cognitive diversity. So usually, at least some types of cognitive diversity can enhance society's problem-solving abilities. There's plenty of research on this, like if you have some people with autism, some people with ADHD, and so on in your company or in society, this is actually good for problem solving. And there's also research that suggests that laziness actually helps us to be creative and to problem solve, and it reminds us about what matters. So perhaps having some lazy people in society may be a good thing. Okay, just checking the time. Okay, so what I've so far tried to show is that there's a great interest in laziness. There are many laziness-related questions that remain unanswered. And I think it'd be good to develop a more constructive approach to laziness. And one way to do that is by developing a concept of laziness that actually increases rather than decreases people's well-being health. And my project aims to significantly contribute to that endeavor. And that was the picture for the cognitive diversity. My hypothesis is that a more defensible kind of laziness would be much narrower than that implied by everyday usage of the concept. So that is that many people who are frequently taken to be lazy would not qualify as such on my account. So in other words, we put too much under this laziness umbrella. And this would imply that even if laziness exists and it is a moral failure, which is contested, of course, many of our behaviors and attitudes that are labeled as lazy by ourselves or others are not in fact lazy. And thus our feelings of disapproval and worthlessness and guilt and stress and so on that typically are associated with laziness are misplaced. Now, how does one go about developing such a novel account of laziness? One that can be expected to improve human well-being and health. So just in the remaining minutes, I'll just try to give you some idea of how I plan to do this. And these are very exploratory thoughts. So I think in trying to find out what exactly laziness is, we should probably aim to compile a list of necessary and sufficient conditions of laziness, or if that's not possible, we can at least try to identify core features of laziness. And I actually found some inspiration, not in the work of academic philosophers, but in a recent podcast series, 7 Deadly Sins by Stephen Fry, which I recommend, at least if you like to listen to Stephen Fry. And in the 8th episode, Fry discusses the sin of sloth, or sloth, he says. And of course, sloth is not synonym with laziness. But many people, including Fry, seem to understand laziness as an important, if not the most important aspect of sloth. And he actually considers sloth to be his very worst sin. So in his podcast series, he said, like, I can warily put my hand up and have the confession dragged from me that it is for me the first sin, the sin of all the sins, with which I most identify, but whose baleful influence on me I most deeply despise and most bitterly regret. Now, so Fry wonders why he thinks he's guilty of sloth. Why of all sins, this is the worst, despite admittedly working very hard. So he admits he works very hard. I do work hard, too hard perhaps. I don't seem to possess the ability to relax, do nothing, he says. So why am I saying that I rue my sloth? Why do I claim to bemoan my inactivity, lament my laziness, lethargy? Why, given the foregoing boastful recitation of my industry and diligence, do I now affect to deplore my indulgence? Surely I'm postering. Surely it's just fake modesty. And interestingly, he explains that to understand this, how a hardworking person like himself still thinks that he's lazy, we need to consider sloth in connection with another one of the 7 deadly sins, pride. To see oneself as slothful requires, according to Fry, a high opinion of oneself and one's possibilities. So he describes, how he works hard, but that at the same time, so he has the brains, he said, and he had lots of opportunities in life, but still, he hasn't done enough with those talents and with all those opportunities that he had. He says, you see, the insufferable pride in me maintains that I'm smart and talented enough to have achieved things of real value and purpose and point in my life. I know, far underachieved given the attributes of my birth. And I think this is really interesting. So I think underachievements may indeed be a good candidate for one of the core characteristics of laziness. Perhaps it's even a necessary condition of laziness. So I think it's a good starting point to try to sort of find out what laziness exactly is. But of course, we will need to specify what sort of underachievement would be required for laziness, because of course we wouldn't associate all sorts of underachievement with laziness. Just to give one example, so an example of a birthday cake. So imagine the scenario where Farid made a fancy cake for his daughter's birthday, but even though he has very good baking skills and put in significant effort, it just didn't work out this time. So Farid clearly underachieved, but it would be weird to say that it was because he was lazy. This just seems like a failed cake attempt. Despite the effort invested in it, it just didn't work out. So we need to say a bit more about what sort of underachievement is required for laziness. And I think it has something to do with a lack of trying, a lack of effort. So if we modify this case a bit, so here we have Betsy. She also tried to make this fancy cake for her daughter's birthday. And she also has very good baking skills. And she could have put in significant effort. I mean, she has the energy, but she didn't. She spent most of the time, that could have been used for baking, watching a Ben Stiller comedy instead. And the cake isn't very good. So again, we can then ask, well, is Betsy's underachievement here the result of laziness? And I think it depends on why she put little effort in the cake, like what her motivation was. So suppose she's just a little bit annoyed with her daughter and wants to make a statement, you know, like, if you don't become nicer with me, you know, I'm not gonna put in too much effort in your cake. And in that case, I think the lack of effort, you know, would be instrumental to send this message. And my hunch is that if one's lack of effort is actually instrumental to serve another purpose, then it doesn't have anything to do with laziness. But suppose she wanted to really bake this good cake. She knew that was the right thing to do, but she couldn't be bothered putting the required effort in, despite having enough energy. And she opted for something easier instead, something requiring no or less effort, like watching this Ben Stiller comedy. And maybe that begins to look more like laziness. So I haven't like a fully worked out definition or theory here. This is just an illustration of how I begin to think about a definition of laziness. So just to end, this thought that, well, what sort of underachievement is required for laziness? I think it has to be some sort of underachievement that involves achieving less than what is required, because one puts in less effort despite having enough energy. I think that is important, and it should be against one's better judgment. But then, of course, further questions are raised, and I haven't had time to do further research into this. But of course, if we say what is required, then we can also ask, well, what is required? Like, just required by your own, what you want, or required by society? So is it just that you want to make a good cake and then you don't put enough effort in it because you just, you know, can't be bothered? Or is it like, even if you don't really want to make that cake, but society thinks that it's really important to make that cake, and then you don't put enough effort in it, is that relevant? I find it an interesting question, like whose expectations matter here, because laziness definitely has something to do with your own expectations, but also societal expectations, and these two, of course, influence each other. Anyway, I don't have like a good answer here. This is just to show where this is going to give you an idea, and I'm just gonna stop here, I think. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, please shoot.